divided the heritage, Constans becoming emperor of the West, Constantius of the East. Neither of them kept towards the old religions the same moderation which their father had done. They joined in issuing a severe edict against paganism, but Constans had to act in his own government with caution and discretion, as paganism still retained a firm hold on the people of the West. Thus he forbade the destruction of heathen temples outside the city walls, as being often rather adjuncts of public games than special supports of paganism. A traveller who visited Rome in 347 found there 7 vestals still remaining, and the worship of Jupiter, of the sun, and of the Mother of the Gods still carried on. Constantius was less fettered, and in his portion of the empire paganism was less powerful; and when, in 350, the death of his brother left him sole emperor, he proceeded against heathen superstitions with great rigour. As the edicts hitherto issued failed to put down heathen practices, in the year 353 he forbade he told heathenish ceremonies under pain of death and confiscation of goods. Prefects who did not enforce the law were to be liable for the same punishments. Only to Rome and Alexandria it was not applied. The emperor himself saw without emotion the old ceremonies still maintained in Rome, and did not interfere with the customs which he found there. But he saw danger to the state in the continued existence of paganism, while the Christians approved of his measures against it, and urged him to further efforts. One effect of the severe laws against paganism was that many persons came into the Church, who, convinced perhaps of the weakness of the heathen deities who endured such insults, had no very solid belief in Christ, nor much disposition to practise Christian virtues; and some, perplexed by the ceaseless strife of conflicting parties, attempted to frame a religion on the ground of the great truths recognized by all. Such were the Massilians, or praying people, described by Epiphanius as gathering together, from the time of Constantine, in simple places of prayer, often mere open enclosures, to worship the one God whom they called the All Sovereign, or again in other places meeting at dawn and at sunset, with abundant kindling of lights, uttering chants and songs of praise made by earnest men of their own brotherhood. These worshippers were found principally in Palestine and Phoenicia. A kindred sect existed about the same time in Cappadocia, of which we have some account in Gregory Nazianzen's funeral sermon for his father, who had belonged to it in his youth. These too worshipped only the All Sovereign, the Most High, but in their practices they seem to have mingled Parsism and Judaism. They rejected idols and sacrifice, but honoured fire and lights. They reverenced the Sabbath, and observed the Mosaic prescriptions as to clean and unclean meats, while they rejected circumcision. The worshippers of Heaven, who appeared at the end of the 4th century in Africa, were probably a kindred sect. The pagans were now in the condition in which the Christians had been a generation or two earlier. They were persecuted by the civil government. As was natural, they attacked the Church with such weapons as were at their command. They spoke and wrote against Christianity. What was good and true in it was, they said, borrowed from the old philosophers; what it had of its own was superstition. Nay, sacred things were even burlesqued in the theatres; and the disputes among Christians about matters which were to the heathen unintelligible did not incline them to look favourably on their religion. Heathenism long kept its hold on the schools and on literature. Heathens taught rhetoric at Athens and philosophy at Alexandria. The principal orators of the time were still heathens, like Libanius, the teacher of John Chrysostom. Neoplatonism sought to rejuvenize paganism, to defend it philosophically, to cover its immoral myths with a decent cloak of allegory. In this way unstable spirits were sometimes attracted and drawn aside. In the latter half of the 4th century the hopes of the pagans experienced a sudden revival. Julian, the son of Julius Constantius, younger brother of the great Constantine, had been brought up as a Christian among men whose Christianity was little likely to attract a very imaginative boy. It was probably his dreamy temperament, as it seemed unlikely to lead him to strive for preeminence in the empire, which saved him from the watchful jealousy of his cousin Constantius, who, Christian as he thought himself, had no scruple in removing any one who stood in his way. When in early manhood he studied at Athens, his fellow student Gregory of Nazianzus foreboded the misery which he was destined to bring on the empire. while the pagan teacher Libanius thought that his profession of Christianity hung upon him like an ass's skin on a lion. Julian was evidently fascinated by the beauty and naturalness of the Greek classical literature much as many Italian princes of the Renaissance were, but we must not suppose that he adopted the myths and opinions of popular paganism. It was hardly possible in that age and with his training. It was with paganism as it appeared in the allegories of the Neoplatonists, and in the mysteries which were the delight of the initiated, that he was in love; a paganism which gave its main worship to one supreme deity, and regarded the gods of the pantheon as mere personifications of his varied attributes. The Christianity of the house of Constantine repelled him, as indeed it could scarcely fail to do. Sent, still young and inexperienced, to preside in Gaul, then torn by intestine divisions and harassed by the Teutonic tribes on the frontier, in 4 years he pacified the country and secured it for a time from external invasion. His success, while it endeared him to the provincials and the army, excited the jealousy of his cousin the emperor, and, to save his own life, he was compelled to lead his army against that of Constantius. The mastership of the empire hung in doubt, when Constantius fell sick and died in the neighbourhood of Tarsus. Julian, the next heir, was generally accepted as his successor, and in December of that same year made his entry into Constantinople. As ruler of the Roman world, Julian could not but help give effect to the convictions which had mastered him. Even on his march through Illyria against his cousin he had caused the temples of the national deities to be opened and their worship resumed. Fairly on the throne, he proclaimed general freedom of worship, and exhorted every one frankly to confess the faith that was in him, and to live in accordance with it. But with all his professed regard for religious equality, he looked upon himself as chosen by the gods to restore the old religions of the empire. He was too wise to proceed against Christianity by the method of blood and iron, which had already so signally failed, but he set in motion a more light-handed persecution, which might in time have produced important effects. Paganism was restored to almost all its old privileges. An edict was issued for the restoration to the temples of their confiscated endowments, most of which had been transferred to Christian churches. Much trouble and litigation ensued. The Christian clergy lost its privileges, payments to Christian churches from the public funds were withdrawn, the philosophic emperor alleging that he did the Christians no wrong in conferring on them the blessing of poverty. He forbade the use of classical literature in Christian schools, on the ground, no doubt ironical, that it was unseemly that books written by men who served the old heathen deities should be expounded by those who believed the gods of Greece to be mere evil demons, misleading the minds of men. As Christianity had not yet produced a philosophic literature of its own, he was aware that this edict, if carried into effect, would separate the rising generation of Christians from the highest culture of the time. He had a great contempt for much that he saw in the Christianity of his time, but he had not lived in the midst of it without finding something in it which was lacking in heathendom. He was conscious of a moral and spiritual power in the religion of Christ which he would fain to have transferred to paganism. He recommended in the strongest terms to his pagan subjects brotherly love and mutual helpfulness. The priests of his religion, in particular, he exhorted to lead pure and beneficent lives. But he rejected with scorn the Galilean, who was the source of the virtues which he admired. The effect, however, of Julian's proceedings was probably much less than he had expected. The pagans doubtless walked with a prouder step, and it is to be feared that some professing Christians joined the religion of the court. The fierce dissensions among Christians no doubt encouraged their enemies to hope that the time of their dissolution was at hand. But in fact the restoration of paganism had little progress. Julian himself complained that few offered sacrifice, and those only to please him. There was no love for the old gods. And in truth the emperor's own personality did not give dignity and impressiveness to his religion. He was no pagan of the old type, vigorous and healthy in mind and body. He was rather an ascetic professor, careless about his dress and his person, but with an odd manner which suggested nervous disorder. But what he might have effected in a long reign must remain unknown. In the midst of his reforms he marched against the Persians, carrying on a war which Constantius had bequeathed to him, and fell in battle, bravely fighting and encouraging his hard-pressed troops, when he had reigned little more than a year and a half. With him fell the hopes of a